and I'm going to share some updates with you about that. All right, let's see. There we go. All right, so just kind of a quick recap of what this project actually is. It's one, of course, as the name implies, seeking to fill data gaps in our oyster knowledge in 6 Gulf estuaries. My team are covering the 2 Panhandle estuaries, but we have 2 estuaries there kind of in the Big Bend area with our Crystal River field lab, and 2 in the southern part of the state that's being covered by our staff in St. Petersburg. So this is all funded through the Deepwater Horizon oil spill settlement funds, and the project itself is a $2.8 million project. So in each one of those estuaries, we are tasked with accomplishing 4 main tasks. Data compilation, which includes bringing in recent water quality and oyster data to develop current status and trends. That is something that, since it was task 1, that we did first. And that report is already available. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Second was benthic oyster habitat and mapping, which really wanted to focus on mapping areas that had not recently been mapped. Each of these estuaries is unique, and some areas have gotten more attention than others. So some of the tasks that we needed to do in one estuary may not have been one that we needed to do in another. Our third task was field assessments and monitoring, which included generally an initial bay-wide survey to, 1, make sure that we actually knew where oyster habitat was and some of these resources, so that we could set up our monthly monitoring stations and carry all of that out. And fourth, that all culminates in a GIS-based Habitat Suitability Index, or HSI, sometimes just called a Habitat Suitability Model as well. And those are generally used as aids for future restoration efforts. All right, so I'm going to go over a little bit of task 1, but I want you to know I'm really simplifying this task. The full report is 119 pages of charts and tables and whatnot. I'm boiling that down to 2 slides. So a bit of an abbreviation. But in general, what we did was search different databases for information, first about oysters, with parameters of interest for us are things like oyster density, percent live, shell height, and reef height. Now, not all estuaries even had some of this data, and not all of them had those parameters, but those were the ones that we were most interested in. We also wanted to look at water quality, where that data was available, that matched the time frame of the oyster samples, and included things like salinity, temperature, dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll A, and K brevis, or red tide. So once we were able to pull all that data together, our statistician used GAMLIS, which is a generalized additive model for location, scale, and shape. Now, I am not the statistician, so I don't understand exactly the inner workings of the model, but essentially it enables us to use these kind of data and a flexible regression that is well suited for dealing with these multiple response variables, especially when you've got multiple environmental things you're trying to find trends with, as well as over-dispersed data. That's very common in ecological data, especially oysters, where you have a lot of zeros and then also some high numbers and everything in between. So using those, we're able to look at what kind of trends have been going on in the last 10 years. So we were just looking at that data from 2010 to 2021. And we looked at 5 of the estuaries that actually had enough data to actually draw any trends. Overall, we found oyster metrics are declining. That's not really a huge surprise for anyone that's been working with oysters for any length of time, as we've pretty much seen a loss of habitat and oyster numbers over the years. Any of these that have an asterisk indicates a strong trend. We may have found, for some of them, we did find a trend, but it was not very strong. And when we look at our water quality, it was a bit of a mixed bag when we look at what the trends are, with some having increasing, some decreasing, but really we didn't find any strong trends in that 11 years of data. All right, so task 2 involved mapping areas of potential or past oyster habitat. And some estuaries, like Pensacola Bay, actually have had recent mapping to their habitat. So we weren't interested in redoing what they have already done. And it actually allowed us to allocate more funds to areas that haven't had recent mapping, like St. Andrews Bay. We contracted the University of New Hampshire to map 54 polygons that we identified first through the Oysters in Florida GIS layer, as well as areas that we found during our 2022 Baywide survey. They completed the mapping portion in February of last year and covered about 1,500 acres. Their data processing is still ongoing, but the completed maps are due by the end of the year, and those will actually update the Oyster in Florida GIS layer for St. Andrews. All right, so this is a close-up of North Bay with the target polygons that we tasked them with in yellow and the side scan mosaic overlay. And you can see how they would often fill in the whole polygon and continue to map between sites, especially if they maybe thought there might be something on the way that they might find. In addition to the acoustic side scan, they are also doing ground truthing at 355 locations with a combination of probe, or essentially a really long PVC pole, tongs, or underwater video. Now, the side scan data lets you know essentially how hard the bottom is. The brighter the return, the harder the bottom. It's the ground truthing that lets you know how to classify what that reflection really is. All right, so this is again North Bay and an overview of their manually drawn polygons of firm bottom that they based on that sonar data. And as you can see here, they found firm bottom in North Bay, but it was often outside the target polygon and never filling the whole polygon in. And this really illustrates how inaccurate those old maps were, where it was essentially people drawing a circle around, I think that there's some oysters here. So once they identified that firm bottom, they would use the ground truthing data to categorize the bottom as either live oyster, rock, shell, sand, or mud, and often a combination of those. I believe that's in East Bay, where we did actually find some nice little clumps on another restore area. Now, they also used their underwater camera, very fancy and high tech, of a GoPro zip tied to a pole. But it did actually prove very nice and useful, as we could download that data essentially right after they put it down and show the video on the iPad. So we really had an idea, within minutes of taking the GoPro. And as you can see here, there's a variety of different bottom types that they did find. Everything from just mud to shell and oysters and everything in between. All right, so task 3 was the task I am most involved with. And it began essentially with our initial assessment, which we call a Baywide survey. This is essentially a rapid survey of potential oyster habitat to see what's actually there. So in 2022, all we had was the Oyster in Florida layer. So that's the guide that we used to identify where we were going to go. All right, so if we zoom in, you can kind of see, again, North Bay. We took that Oyster in Florida layer. We placed the grid over it. give us our sample stations. And since there were really not that many polygons, we decided just to visit them all. We figured it would only take us a few days to visit them all. And so that's kind of what we did. There's a few exceptions to polygons that we didn't visit. One is the FWC West Bay project, which we were helping survey, so we already knew that there were oysters there, as well as nerdicites that are already being monitored by the DEP and Aquatic Preserve. Again, we already knew that there were oysters there, so there's no need for us to go. We also skipped any polygons that were smaller than 2 acres. Any smaller than that, and it's really hard to actually get on top of those spots. We also visited any other areas on our GPS plotter that said oysters, because that seemed like a good idea. Or any other spots that the captain had a good feeling about. All right, so for the Baywide survey, we would use either a PVC pole or a diver if it's too deep to first assess what kind of substrate there was. So if there was oyster or firm bottom, if there was mud, sand, or seagrass. If there's mud, sand, or seagrass, we wouldn't sample those with quadrats. We would mark down the substrate type, but we would move on. If there was oyster or firm bottom, we would send a scuba diver down with our 1/4 meter quadrat and collect 5 quadrats per station. This is essentially the same kind of survey that we do in Apalachicola Bay every year, as well as all of our colleagues down in Central and South Florida. We would collect data on things like the sample weight, number and size of live oysters, and number of recently dead oysters, as well as oyster drills. So what we ended up finding, we visited 45 stations, the majority of which were actually in East Bay, because there's just more small polygons in East Bay. Found 3 main strata, that oyster or hard bottom in nearly half of our samples, mud in 40%, and sand in 13%. We collected 100 quadrats, and despite having visited more stations in East Bay, we actually collected more quadrats in West Bay. East Bay was close behind, and North Bay had the least of all with 25. We found just shy of 3,800 oysters. Again, the majority of which were in West Bay, but a good amount in North Bay and just a few in East Bay. And we looked at oysters that are larger than just spat. So baby oysters smaller than 30 millimeters, we really only found 60. That was mostly in West Bay with a few in East Bay. And as far as legal oysters, we didn't find any on any of these spots. And one thing to keep in mind is that all these spots that we did check in the Baywide survey were ones that have not received any restoration in at least the past 10 years. So we could really see quite the difference in those in the NERDA areas that the Aquatic Preserve monitors. So using what we kind of found during our Baywide survey and data from the Aquatic Preserve and DEP, we're able to choose our survey sites. So we split the bay up into 3 sections, which are very nicely labeled as west, north, and east. All of our stations were monitored for recruitment. 2 of the stations in each of the section were chosen to also include sedimentation monitoring, and 2 stations in the bay were chosen to deploy continuous water quality sondes, which are called STAR ODIs. So for our recruitment monitoring, follows again the same protocol we use statewide, and is where we deploy 3 floating T-bars at each station that have suspended oyster shell on a wire. We visit these each month, and the trap is cleaned, the stringers are swapped for fresh shell, and the samples returned to the lab for processing. Back at the lab, we count all the spat we find on the undersides of the middle shells, and knowing how many spat and the length of time deployed, we can then determine a relative recruitment rate for each station and month. All right, so these graphs show us the past 2 years of recruitment in each of the stations. And we typically have seen recruitment start in about April or May and extend out to about October and November. That's generally what we see in our kind of northern estuaries like Pensacola and Apalachicola Bay as well. Usually by the time water temperatures are rising above 20 degrees, that's when you start to see oyster settlement. You can see that West Bay has had fairly consistent rates both of those years, whereas North and East Bays, they had okay years in 2023, but actually much better rates in 2024. And North Bay actually had a peak in the spring, whereas East Bay had more of a peak in the fall. All right, so our sedimentation monitoring was done at the same time as our recruitment, visiting those sites monthly and servicing our high-tech sediment traps, which are PVC cups tied to a cinder block. Those essentially sit out all month, and as material settles out of the water, is captured in that cup. We collect all of those, clean our traps, and then bring the samples back to the lab where we dry and then weigh all the sediment. Now, unlike recruitment, sediment hasn't shown any real clear seasonal or spatial patterns. We're going to be looking a little bit more closely into using more advanced statistical techniques to see if we can draw any strong conclusions from this data. But there is definitely sedimentation going on out there, definite peaks and valleys. And it will be interesting later to actually find out what might be driving some of these things. All right, so during each of our monitoring trips, we also collect water quality data. We use a YSI to collect point samples of temperature, salinity, and DO. And in mid-2023, we also began deploying continuous water quality sondes called star ODIs. These are relatively small and inexpensive units that we anchored in place with a cinder block. They're relatively inexpensive, but they're still not cheap. So we wanted to make sure, for one, that our method of deploying them didn't actually end up in us losing them, because they are still a few $100s. But we've really only lost a couple in the last couple of years, so that's a pretty good rate for field equipment. All right, so temperature data kind of looks pretty much exactly like you would expect. There's really little difference in the areas, and it's warmer in the summer and colder in the winter. Just note here that the star ODI data does start in mid-2023. That's why they don't line up exactly. And we already have data all the way through February of this year. So that's why they don't match up exactly, but they still show the same trend. Our salinity has much less of a seasonal pattern, but we do see that in general, West Bay tends to be saltier. It is closest to the pass, after all. And North and East Bays tend to have a larger bit of fluctuation. Again, not too surprising as they are closer to sources of fresh water. And once again, just note that star ODI scale starts in the mid-2023, so that's why they don't line up exactly. But you can see how variable that East Bay really is in the star ODI data. All right, lastly, we have our dissolved oxygen data, which also shows a seasonal pattern like we would expect, with higher DOs in the winter and lower in the summer. But an important thing to note that we didn't actually see any low or anoxic areas during our sampling, which is very good for oysters. Now, task 4 is where we're going to bring all these things together, everything we've learned in the first 3 tasks, and we're going to combine all the data that we've either collected from the past, collected ourselves, and combine that to produce an HSI. And these are things that are intended to act as aids for future restoration, giving different practitioners good ideas of where they may want to be focusing their restoration efforts. Now, in bays like Pensacola that already have HSIs, again, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here, but our data will hopefully be used to update and supplement those models. And in areas that don't have HSIs, like St. Andrews, we'll be developing ones that have used the data that we've collected. We're currently prioritizing regions with upcoming restoration areas like Swanee Sound, who may be receiving restoration material as soon as next year. But regardless, all of our HSIs should be completed and available by the end of next year. All right, so in summary, the FL-TIG project has compiled data to examine the status and trends of oyster populations. We've mapped potential oyster habitats, and we've been providing monthly recruitment and sedimentation monitoring, as well as our initial baywide survey in St. Andrews. And all of this will come together in an HSI, which will aid future restoration efforts. So with that, I need to just thank my hardworking field crew, because really, I don't do much of this work. It's really my field crew. So I want to give them all the credit that they're due. And yeah, if we have any extra time, I will gladly answer questions.
Thanks, Matt. I'm gonna have us hold questions until both presentations are done, but if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And we'll get Whitney started with her presentation and then open it up for both of them.
Sounds good.
You ready for me?
Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, I know some of the people on this call probably already have heard me present this information, but happy to provide a bit more context as you guys develop, a plan for oysters, recovering oysters in your own bay system. So I'll be kind of giving you an overview of a lot of different elements, but kind of stepping you through the steps that we took to get where we are now, and kind of where we plan to go in the next year or so for this project. So really just starting with the basics. A lot of people have seen this map, but really just focusing in on where oysters used to be historically. So this has been obviously a tremendous cultural resource for us since, the early decades. And we really just want to get back to a thriving oyster fishery, which we are, of course, very far away from, but it's nice to understand where we were in the past and really start to learn kind of what the demise of these oysters were over time, so we can stop treating the symptoms and really start treating the causes. If you look at this graph, it really shows the boom and bust of the oyster fishery here in Pensacola since the 1950s. There have been several factors that have contributed to the decline of these oyster populations, including poor water quality, including sedimentation, storms, and overharvest. And really, since 2010, there has not been an active commercial fishery in Pensacola after that crash, and there's really no longer any infrastructure here for harvesting oysters at that scale. We published in 2023 our State of the Bays report, and prior to that in 2021, we worked in tandem with TNC and Santa Rosa County to, like Matt did for you guys in St. Andrew, we did an updated mapping exercise for Pensacola Bay, since the last mapping had been done around 2009, 2010 timeframe. And at that time, there were about 980 acres that were estimated in the Escambia and East and Blackwater Bay area. And as of 2021, we're down to about 480 acres of oyster reef. Obviously, we have defined this as critical condition for this ecosystem. And we really started to take steps to figure out the best, path to recovery. This really started not even with our program. Before our program was really, as we were getting kind of started in 2019 with the support from the state and stakeholders in the Pensacola Bay system, the Nature Conservancy launched a project to develop an oyster ecosystem-based fisheries management plan. And for the purposes of Pensacola, they really defined that as, integration of 3 essential elements, that being wild harvest of the oyster fishery, oyster aquaculture, and also oyster habitat. And really, this was a massive effort that was a facilitated process for several years. And it was, took over 78 individual stakeholder interviews. There were 27 working group members, lots of in-person and virtual meetings, several workshops. They brought in experts and staff to give presentations on several different topic areas. And just a lot of work went into really being thoughtful about the different steps and the different priorities that we need to be keeping in mind to really do the best we can to recover not just oysters, but really that complete ecosystem and restoring the services they provide to our communities and all of those elements. So they really wanted this to be developed by the community. This isn't, just a one entity plan. It's the community's plan, and really wanted to be open and transparent to allow all voices to be heard. There was tremendous support from all sectors and stakeholders. And it was really just, achieving consensus from several different groups. And so there was several, we still continue this today with our oyster subcommittee, but the stakeholder working group was, really a lot of different entities coming together. So nonprofit organizations, academics, the oyster fishery, both aquaculture and wild harvesters, and several state and federal entities as well. So really just bringing everyone to one table to really look at the available science and really start to develop that, kind of decision support matrix that is needed for oyster recovery. So it's really an ecosystem-based fisheries management approach. So currently there's not a statewide oyster management or restoration plan to serve as a guide. So in the discussions with the state agencies, it's really been a bay scale kind of planning approach, since each bay, like we know, has very unique conditions, oyster population, industry, local community support. And so really looking at this from a bay-wide scale really provides us with a path forward specifically for the Pensacola Bay system in our, in our neck of the woods, and just managing this based on the current conditions and future conditions. So this is really looking at it based on several different objectives. So really we wanted this to be a science-based, community-driven, and actionable plan to really support the recovery of both the habitat and the fishery. So there's really 4 main pillars of the Pensacola Bay Oyster Fisheries and Habitat Management Plan. So one being ecology, wild harvest and aquaculture, economy, and public education and communication. So really looking at it in terms of wanting a healthy and productive oyster reef ecosystem, and then, of course, looking at the oyster fishery and aquaculture industry as part of that, and then leading to a thriving economy connected to the Pensacola Bay system, and really having that engaged and informed community to help us make those decisions. So they built this oyster habitat management plan, and then they were like, well, I wonder who is going to be the best entity to kind of move this forward and implement it. And so since we were part of the stakeholder working group, we're like, yes, we'll do it. And so our program really incorporated these elements of the plan, the main key priorities, into our 5th goal, which is conserving and restoring critical habitats. So one of those being oysters. And so we really wrapped up the stakeholder working group and just had a seamless transition from building that plan to then immediately getting started on implementing it while the energy and focus was there. And so this really ensured that the plan would be put into action through a cooperative, adaptive, and ecosystem-based approach. So along that line, like Matt had just talked about, with those different bay systems, we've been busy, with data collection efforts. So bottom type mapping, like I talked about before, building habitat suitability model, which I'll touch on for the Pensacola Bay system, building a water filtration model, doing vision mapping exercises, as you can see on the left with our stakeholders, putting maps on the table, looking at existing data layers and, where some of these priority areas that we need to think about restoring oysters. And again, that stakeholder input is critical to the process. And then this summer and fall, we're going to be adding on to what Matt and his group has been doing and doing a bit more site-specific oyster spat and larval monitoring this summer and fall to inform restoration design. So we looked at this before, but as an oyster reef kind of map, but this also gives the bottom type. So now we kind of know in these specific areas where we know oysters once existed, what that bottom type looks like now. So looking at, areas that are moderately firm or have, buried shell or existing reef are some of those key areas. And then, areas that are maybe softer mud or that, sinky material, we are being very cognizant of not, of course, not laying a foundation first is very critical to having that relief necessary for oyster settlement. So those are all decisions that, we're discussing with our groups internally for what makes the most sense and what's the most, cost effective, and where are these priority areas and what does the bottom look like there. This is an recently updated. This is kind of still tentative, but we've been working with Laura Gesselbrock on her. I know she's on this call, so she can add more detail after my presentation, but we were building off the HSM that's already been built by the Nature Conservancy. So we added a bit more data to this model, and then we actually added a few more factors that we had information for as well that are critical to oyster growth and survival. So right now, these are actually the rankings in order of the weights that we've put in the HSM. So salinity being number 1, current oyster reef extent, bottom dissolved oxygen, substrate type, looking at larval recruitment, historical oyster reef extent, temperature, turbidity, and then chlorophyll A. And so we're still kind of tweaking the model and looking at, what factors are the most important and how we basically assign weights to these to be the most accurate for our bay system. And then, like I mentioned before, this water filtration model, again, Laura had worked with other folks from TNC and Lena from University of Edinburgh, and they built we combined efforts. So EPA already had a hydrodynamic model for the Pensacola Bay system, and researchers had already been working on an oyster filtration component, looking at clearance rates and all of those items. We basically meshed together, and we're able to get kind of a restoration ranking in terms of the benefit from water filtration in different areas. And so the restoration order you can see in the left, the darkest blue is kind of that top restoration ranking, and then it kind of goes down the line in terms of specifically water filtration ecosystem service. So this is just really one of the several different data layers that we've been using to inform decision making. And like I mentioned, we've had several stakeholder workshops, really the first of which to kind of bring all these data layers together. This was almost 2 years ago now, looking at basically that first look at where are these priority areas really going to be, like what is the vision of oyster restoration in the Pensacola Bay system. And so we had great turnout for this. I think there were close to 60 people in the room, from different agencies and organizations, and I'll talk about how we've built on that over time as well. So this is kind of a combination of all those different maps that I've showed you on top of what came out of that vision mapping workshop, which are those green polygons. And so based on several different factors, we've kind of been refining these over time. So those being, of course, the prioritization that came out of that first stakeholder group, but now, as we collect more information and have more feedback, then we can start to tweak those areas. And I'll show you kind of what we did in the next workshop to kind of build off of this. So really just trying to give you an idea of kind of how we got here. So I've, talked about the TNC-led stakeholder working group, building the oyster management plan for the Pensacola Bay system, incorporating that into our CCMP, collecting the necessary data to be able to inform these decisions that we make, and then really establishing that Pensacola Bay Oyster Restoration Initiative vision, which we've done. And so now we're acquired the funding to implement this, and we've been working off a NOAA infrastructure grant funding that we put in a proposal for with several partners that are on this call. So FWC, DEP, Sea Grant, and several different entities have been involved in this process along the way to really make this vision a reality. And so really, where are we now? We were awarded a $10.9 million grant, and really our long-term target is to restore 600 hectares of oyster reef over the next 10 years. And our more short-term target is to restore up to 100 over the next 4 to 5 years. And so we've, of course, this was not done by our program staff alone. We are guided by several project advisors. So we have a special project action team called SPAT for short, some of which are on the call. Representatives from NOAA, FWC, Sea Grant, the Nature Conservancy, DEP, and Santa Rosa County. And then we also have our oyster subcommittee, which is made up about 60 to 70 people, made up of, different entities from our community that were really represented in the oyster stakeholder working group. And then we also work very closely with our wild harvesters, our aquaculture farmers, and our tribal members here in the Pensacola Bay system. So we've worked really hard to get to this point, and we have a very long road to go, but I'm excited about where this is going to take us. So in February of this year, we had another workshop where this is really the outcome that we're teasing apart all the details, but it looks like a fun confetti map of all the different teams that got together and built oyster reefs out of Legos. I'll show a picture of that in a little bit. So really just thinking about this scaling up aspect. So having this be one program, working off one bay-wide permit and not permitting each project separately, which is very time intensive and expensive as well. So we're trying to think about this in a big way, bigger scale, and looking at multiple restoration techniques as well. So right now we're working with Jacobs Engineering. They are leading the design and engineering part of this project. And so we've had, that first stakeholder meeting of this night, kind of second iteration to refine that reef placement and talk about materials. And the next steps are going to be getting to that 30, 60, and 90% designs. And we will be continuing community engagements this summer and fall as well. So these are images from that workshop. We scaled different size Legos to the Pensacola Bay system. And so each little dot on the Lego was, I think, 1 acre. And so you were able to kind of piece together on a transparency and trace out basically your oyster design. So we kind of did this in sections. So one of which you were just kind of thinking about location, and then we were thinking about pros and cons of different materials. And then the second day was kind of an oyster restoration design challenge. So we called it the Oyster Trail. And so the teams really got together and could build, put Legos on top of each other to get that relief that you want. And then each individual color was a different material. And so you were able to combine that all together to really get the winning design, which was the most, cost effective for the amount of hectares that we were building. So it was a really fun exercise. We're still, going through the elements of the kind of the takeaways from that. And it's been a great feedback that we've gotten from that workshop. So really the part 2 is to restore that, first 250 acres. So we will be thinking about harvestable and non-harvestable reefs. And then we're partnering with local oyster industry volunteers, Oyster Corps, and marine contractors to really implement that restoration. We're able with this grant to support local oyster industry. So we're working with our farmers and harvesters, what we call an oyster stipend program. So we're actually able to provide funding to them, compensate them for their time in giving us their expertise and knowledge on various project aspects of that. So that's been a really unique opportunity for us. And then in addition to that, I won't go into immense detail on this, but there's several milestones as part of this project, not just oyster restoration, but really addressing the root causes of these issues. So there's several active eroding gullies in our watershed. And so one of which will be designing the restoration of the Sandy Hollow Gully, which is one of the largest actively eroding gullies in the state of Florida. And really the combined target is to reduce 100,000 tons of sediment entering the system annually. And that design will come to a close at the end of this year. And then this spring, we're also putting out a request for proposals for a sediment reduction prioritization action plan for the watershed as well. So looking at those main contributors and trying to make those next steps in terms of remediation of those. And really the main takeaway is it takes a village to do these things. It's been a long road. And this is us enjoying some local oysters from one of our oyster harvesters. And really just wanted to give kudos to all the people that have helped us get here along the way. And we have several steps left in the process, but I will take any questions. I know that people probably have questions for Matt as well, but that's all I have.
Thanks, Whitney. And thank you, Matt. We'll go ahead and open it up to questions. So saw a few in the chat, but if you have a question and want to come off mute, please feel free. Now I'll read through some of the questions.
Yeah.
All right, I think for Matt, can you show the chart you showed at the beginning of the presentation with the % of live oysters found?
Is this the one? And I think this may be the one. I also provided the slideshow to Ryan as well. So I don't know if you wanted to send that out.
I'll send it out with the notes and put it on the website, so that'll be available. For some reason, your screen is not like loading to show.
Oh, something went wrong.
It says double click to enter full screen mode. I don't know. On my end.
Is that? Can you see stuff now?
Nope.
Huh.
Weird.
It says please close all browsers. It sounds like a trick. I'm sorry.
We'll send that out so you'll be
Yeah.
able to see it. The next question is, I'm interested to know if there's a plan to use these HSIs in either or both systems to develop a BOSCAD permit for restoration activities instead of individual one-off. So Whitney or Matt can take that.
I think Whitney kind of answered that with her. She actually did have a slide in there about doing just that.
Yep. Definitely don't
Yeah,
want to do
we're-
it project by project. That is 100% true.
Yeah, as she can attest, oyster restoration is expensive. So utilizing those economies of scale is going to be key to reaching any of these goals.
Yeah, and we actually have been already speaking with FDAX and Army Corps and the like, and we're kind of at least on a good path forward in terms of how we're going to partner with FWC and DP to apply for a larger permit. So we're kind of just in the steps of that and trying to get to those, 30 and 60% designs. But we've started the permitting discussion way earlier. So we can bring everyone into the conversation before it's, too late. So that has been the key to success there.
Thanks, Whitney. You said FDAX and DEP, but what about the Corps?
Yeah, we are working with, I'm trying to think of the specific contacts that we've been working with at the Corps, but we're looking at actually doing a restoration permit from FDAX, which would cover some of it, and then we're working with the Corps to kind of see what that looks like. But they've been on board in terms of kind of the approach that we're taking, but we have yet to kind of put in the full application. But we basically have kind of a group of contacts from each entity that we've been working closely with to make this happen, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be as much of a hurdle as we had thought previously. So that has been very good.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah.
Great job.
Any other questions from folks online?
Yeah.
We've got some questions in the room, so just let us know if you can't hear us.
It seemed to me when I was looking at the charts that you were showing, the maps, that the historic reefs were in the far north part of the bay. But the proposed restoration is further south. Is that a correct interpretation of what I saw?
So for Whitney.
Whitney, yes.
Yes, it is. So current conditions really don't allow for good oyster survival up in at least the north part of Escambia Bay. There's a lot of sedimentation that occurs in that area. And it's also the salinity dynamics are a lot different than they once were. And so really we've been told by several that really north of that bridge, the I-10 bridge, is really not suitable for oyster habitat. It's very muddy, silty bottom, and there's really no relief there anymore. South of the bridge, there actually are some oyster reefs that have quite a few live oysters on them on that kind of western part of the Garson Point Peninsula that sticks out in Pensacola Bay system. So that has become one of their priority areas that people have identified. But really those upper areas, like especially in Blackwater, there used to be extensive oyster reefs there and they've been completely covered up with sediment and smothered. So
is it also an issue of water quality changes? In other words, if you were to put aquaculture cages up near the surface in that area, would they also have a high mortality?
The farmers have had some mortality, especially this past summer. They had very extended periods of time with very low salinities in the single digits and very high temperatures. And so they were getting mortality from those events. One of our oyster farmers just got a data buoy actually that he just put out on his farm so he can monitor that real time. We were just talking, actually last night to another set of oyster farmers that have a hatchery here in Pensacola. And they are seeing with their oysters, the diploid oysters that they're pulling out of the bay. I think they pulled them closer out of like Bayou Chico area, so one of the urban bayous. and they're seeing like a 90% mortality of those oysters, even though they're in the exact same water as their triploid and hybrid oysters. And so we're trying to figure out, you know, if that would be a genetic issue. They're really not getting many good answers. Doesn't look to be disease induced, so we're still trying to figure that out. But yeah, there's been some die off definitely in the oyster aquaculture industry, but it's normally based on the very low salinities from high rainfall events and very high temperatures in the summer.
Are those aquaculture activities, are they in the southern part of the bay?
Yeah, most of the farms that exist are just kind of in that central part of like lower Pensacola Bay by the Garcon Point Bridge.
And nobody has wanted to put anything up in the northern part.
We
They're
did
aware
have,
of it.
yeah, we had one farmer that had a spot in East Bay, and then she actually had to move her farm because of the expanded shellfish prohibited harvest area by FDACS that happened in 2021. And so she had just started her farm and had to pick up and move over to Escambia Bay, just outside of the prohibited shellfish harvest area in that bay. So she had to pick up everything and move the farm.
It wasn't that they weren't growing, it was that they couldn't be harvested.
Correct. They were actually growing really well at her previous farm location in East Bay. But she wasn't going to be able to harvest there, so she had to reapply for a new lease and start over.
If I make one more question, I'm just curious, what factors contribute to that filtration capacity that you made a map of?
I'll let Laura speak to that because she was the one that really was critical. And
Yeah, I think she jumped
did she drop off? Okay. I did attach the paper in the chat. There were several different factors, and I think they ran several simulations of different, you know, amounts of restoration, and then looking at oyster clearance rates. And there were several different things, but off the top of my head, I can't list those right now. But if Ryan can share the paper that was published in the last couple years.
And I can add a little bit to that. TNC has developed an oyster calculator, and you put in the size of your bay, how often you'd want the water flushed or treated, and then it'll generate the acres of oyster reef that you need to achieve that filtration rate for the system.
I'll send out that paper when I send out the notes and the presentations too. And the link to the tool.
Yes, the link to the tool. I was just trying I have it favorited so I can drop it in the chat too.
I think Joy just did. So
oh, great. Yes, that's exactly what it is. Perfect. Thanks, Joy.
They also have a fish production calculator that looks at salt marsh, I believe seagrass and oyster reef. And I believe they developed that model using a couple of our bays here. I think St. Andrew was one of them. And so you basically put into the system how much salt marsh acreage, oyster reef acreage, and seagrass, and it will generate the fish production that would be expected based on that amount of habitat. So it's a couple of really good tools to show the ecosystem services provided by those habitats.
Great point, Daryl.
Could you say that again? I didn't hear you.
Great point. I had forgotten about that.
I see a question from Melody in the chat asking about if HSIs are planned for Saskatchewan or St. Andrews Bay and then Chalk as well. I think that was for you, Matt.
Yeah, we don't have any plans for doing any HSIs for Choctawhatchee. That was just one of the, there's only so many bays that we could have chosen when the grant was being developed. So Choctawhatchee was not one of them. St. Andrews will get one. St. Joe won't, but it's mostly because that's it's not it's not a great oyster habitat. It's a great scallop habitat. So an oyster habitat suitability model wouldn't be great, but a scallop one would. So if anyone knows where I can get some money to do that,
Yeah.
send it my way.
It's on our wish list as well, Matt.
Right.
All right, any other questions from folks?
I have a question. Matt, you showed a chart with trends in water quality, and one of them was temperature and salinity. Was that bottom, top, or whole column?
Probably the average. It's probably whatever data that we had available. So that would really you have to just kind of dig into the report itself, because some of that data is coming from DEP, some of it's coming from Baywatch. I don't exactly know. Probably the mean, if I were to guess, but yeah.
All right. Last call for a few more questions, and then we'll shift into just a few closing things before we wrap up. All right, well, thank you, Matt and Whitney, for taking the time to give us the update and share kind of the process for the Pensacola Bay Oyster Restoration Initiative. It's really helpful, and hopefully we'll get to do some good things with all the results from Matt's work that can help us push that forward here. So, I'm gonna share my screen. All right, so I just wanted to take a few minutes to do group announcements and let you know a few things that we have coming up, and please feel free to shout out anything that you guys have coming up as well. Our Tides and Talks series is wrapping up in May. Our last one is May 8th, and it'll be an open house style, so all of our staff will be there, kind of talking about the Estuary program and all the different projects we have. These are at Destination Panama City from 3 to 4 p.m. And so we'd love to see you before we close out our Ties and Talks for this spring semester of talks, I guess we'll call them. We also are moving forward with our second race for the bays. So this will be Saturday, September 27th, 2025 at Conservation Park. And we have expanded this race to now include a 10K. So for all of you that like a little longer distance, we now have that option. So please save the date and stay on the lookout for updates about when you can register. If you want to sponsor or volunteer, we'll need all the help we can get with this. But put that on your calendars, and we'd love to see you guys there in any sort of capacity. And then just a reminder, we had kind of had a brief hiatus of meetings for the peak summer months with all the vacation and field work that we all have. So we'll resume our meeting in August. We'll have another guest presentation, and then we'll wrap up with me handing over some of the science and technical meetings to Jessica, as I will be out on maternity leave for the rest of this year after our August meeting. So communications will shift a little bit to Jessica and Rose for October and December meetings, and probably a little bit into the new year as well. So I'll see you in August, and then I won't see you for a while, but I'm coming back.
Congratulations, Brian.
Thank you. And those are our big updates that we just wanted to share. So if there are any announcements that y'all have for your orgs, anything going on, please feel free to drop it in the chat or come on off mute.
I love that background photo, by the way.
Yes.
Of us running that perfect
Yes,
transect.
it's a very transect.
Come on,
Yep, this is Project Green Shores over in Pensacola. for
Cheryl,
our
great
Sea Stars
capture.
project.
Yeah, that was the day y'all almost got eaten by a shark.
It wasn't shark, they were drum.
Hey, but they look like shark.
They
They
sure
could've
did.
eaten you. They were that big.
All right, well, that is all that we had for today. So thank you again, Matt and Whitney, for your presentations. We really appreciate it. Hope everyone has a great rest of your week, and we'll be in touch with sending out the notes and recording and presentations.
Thank y'all
Thanks,
for the
everybody.
presentations.
Thanks,
all.
Ryan.
Sorry.
Ryan, do you want me to share like a PDF of the PowerPoint? Does
That would be perfect.
Okay, we'll do that. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Y'all have a good
Bye,
afternoon.
thank you.
Bye, everybody.